Some of the people who've been trying to warn us to take Trump literally and seriously are doing just that in the case that Trump should be reelected president in November. Members of the January 6th Select Committee, the members of Congress and their staffs who have done more than anyone else to pull the curtain back on Trump's efforts to overturn an election he lost, are now bracing for Trump's much promised public promises of retribution should he prevail in November. And his plan is, as we all know, to weaponize the Justice Department and use it to go after all of the people he perceives as political opponents. Former January 6 committee member Zoe Lofgren telling the Los Angeles Times this, quote, if he intends to eliminate our constitutional system and start arresting his political enemies, I guess I would be on that list. One thing I did learn on the committee is to pay attention and listen to what Trump says because he means it. The Los Angeles Times goes on to say this, quote, Lofgren added that she does not yet have a plan in place to thwart potential retribution by Trump, but Representative Adam Schiff, who has long been a burr in Trump's side, said he's having real-time conversations with his staff about how to make sure he stays safe if Trump follows through on his threats. Quote, we're taking this seriously because we have to, Schiff said. We have seen this movie before and how perilous it is to ignore what someone is saying when they say they want to be a dictator. Trump didn't just say he wants to be a dictator just once. He's now said it over and over again in public, in speeches, in front of his supporters, in all sorts of different ways, many, many times. His allies in the right-wing media and think tanks say it too.
Under no circumstances, you are promising America tonight, you would never abuse power as retribution against anybody.
Except for day one. They have done something that allows the next party. I mean, if I happen to be president and I see somebody who's doing well and beating me very badly, I say, go down and indict them.
A Democrat charging his opponent. Nobody's ever seen anything like it. That means that if I win and somebody wants to run against me, I call my attorney general. I say, listen, indict him.
Do you regret not locking her up? And if you're president again, will you lock people up?
Well, I'll give you an example. The answer is you have no choice because they're doing it to us.
On the evening after we've won, the accountability project's going to start, and it's going to be thorough this time. It's going to be, they're going to be in prison.
They're going to be in prison. No evidence of them committing any crimes. Crimes are opposing Trump. Folks, we've said it here before, don't get numb. These are not empty threats. These are not bluster or bloviating. I mean, they're that too, but they're very real. Plans are being drawn up, like white paper kind of plans, and they're chilling. Here's what Liz Cheney had to say about that last week.
One of the individuals has talked about how he wants Trump to appoint him to be Attorney General for 3 weeks, and at the end of 3 weeks, he's going to leave Washington with a pardon from Trump, and he's laid out, his plans for those 3 weeks, which include indictments, detentions. I mean, it's chilling, and it's tempting to listen to these people and think, well, they're crackpots. And they are, but a crackpot with power is really dangerous.
So, Tim, we know from your probe that they wanted to invoke the Insurrection Act. They wanted to get to that point where they had, even in their view, some sort of predicate for invoking the Insurrection Act. And what's extraordinary to me is that in some corners of the media, especially conservative media, who may not be conservative enough to be viewed as part of the project, in just about every corner of big business, people think that wouldn't affect them. But the worst thing for the economy, the worst thing for a free press, if you care at all about it, is political instability. And invoking the Insurrection Act and turning the military against your own citizenry is the most politically destabilizing thing that can happen on the planet.
Yeah, absolutely, Nicole. That's right. And we showed that again and again over the course of our hearings, that with the Department of Justice, with the Department of Defense, that the former president believed that those were sort of instruments of his political interest, that he wanted to invoke the Insurrection Act, as you said, because there were domestic protests completely inconsistent with the historic limitations of the military. And thankfully, men like Mark Esper and Mark Milley were there to tell him, no, you can't do that. He wanted to use the Department of Justice to pursue these baseless allegations of voter fraud. And he was about to install an attorney general who would have sent some letter to the states basically saying, because of our serious concerns about the election, you should convene special sessions. No basis in fact or law for that. And he was thwarted again by adults in the room. My fear is that those adults won't be in the room this time, that the currency for service in a second term would be loyalty, not competence. And that's chilling, as you said, right? Thankfully, there were people in place who were guardrails, who respected norms and respected the independence of those agencies. If the second term occurs, that may not happen. Let me just share one quick story, Nicole, about what
Please.
President Obama said to us when I was a U.S. attorney. So I was really fortunate to be presidentially appointed, confirmed by the Senate, a United States attorney. And then when there were about 50 of us who were confirmed in the beginning of the Obama administration, we all went to the White House for this sort of meet and greet with the president. And he said to us, "You're not my lawyer. You should not look at yourselves as President Obama's lawyer. And you shouldn't think for a minute about whether you should do something that does or doesn't help Obama. You should do what is best for the people of your district." And to me, right, that's right. Like I so appreciated and respected that I was being told to separate politics, to separate the man who'd appointed me's political interest and do what was right for the Western District of Virginia where I served. That's been the history across parties. Republicans and Democrats have imposed that at justice, have held to that at justice. And if we ever shrink from that, man, I quake to imagine what could happen with respect to our criminal justice system.
Well, I mean, and I think what Trump is proposing on paper is two train stops away from that, right? On the spectrum, the next stop is what we saw in Trump 1, right? An extremely political Justice Department, where Bill Barr put his thumbs on the scales of justice in the Mueller probe, in cases involving Trump's allies. What Trump's proposing, again, on paper, out loud in writing, is turning it into a personal retribution center. I mean, this is the agency that in his view, in his telling to his own supporters, will eke out retribution by, in his words, quote, indicting his political opponents.
So I have two thoughts. One is, for those people who are skeptical, thinking, well, maybe he won't do it. Maybe, I have to wait and see. I would say he is saying it now. Leave aside whether he would do it. If you want to know the choice of who to vote for and what the rule of law means, he has told you now. He has said what his view is of the rule of law, which is we are not a nation of laws. We are a nation of men and women, meaning that he can just decide who goes to jail and who doesn't. He has told you his view now. This is not predictive. You can look at exactly what he is saying now about how he views the Constitution and the construct of the rule of law here. And the other is, in looking at that construct, facts do not matter for the same reason we talked about that he does not want.
Just say it's corrupt. Our allies will do the rest.
He wants President Zelensky just open an investigation. We'll do the rest. Jeffrey Clark, just say you've got an investigation. That's enough. Facts do not matter for the same reason he is trying to avoid all of these trials and desperately filing motion after motion to delay things. He does not care about, he doesn't want facts to come out. And in terms of who gets charged, it would be totally fine if he said, the people on January 6th committee, these are the crimes they've committed, and these are the facts to support it. Then you'd be like, okay, but what left out of everything he's saying is any discussion about what it means to have a country based on the rule of law, which is you need to have a crime and you need to have facts. The facts and law are something that should still matter to people. And what he is saying is he's telling you now who he is.
He's running on it. It's unbelievable.
Hey, everyone. MSNBC has a new and improved app. You'll get real-time alerts and analysis, live blogs, in-depth essays, video highlights, and the best 2024 election coverage. Download the new MSNBC app. Here's how to do it. You tap on the App Store on your phone. You hit search on the bottom right corner. You type in MSNBC. You click on the MSNBC app. You click on Get or the cloud icon and enjoy it.